Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Spence and Partners webinar. We will start in 1 minute. We'll just give people a chance to get signed on. Thank you. Okay, that's 1 minute past 2, so we'll make a start. Welcome again to this webinar from Spence and Partners. Probably the first thing I should say is that the webinar is being recorded, so you're aware, and a link to the recording will be sent to you after the webinar. Today's topic is the general/single code. And the reason we've used that title is originally the code, which was consulted on some time ago, was called the single code. It's now known as the general code, and we will explain why there's been that slight change in terminology. And I say we because I am joined today by my colleagues, Caitlin Watson, Graham Cunningham, Rachel Graham, and moderating the webinar is Rebecca Lavender from our marketing practice. And the plan today is to give you a bit of context, then to take you through the latest acronyms added to the pensions industry lexicon, the Effective System of Governance, or ESoG, and the Own Risk Assessment, or ORA. And I'll use the abbreviations as shorthand as we go through. But for me, the way to kind of think of them in the context of this general code and the requirements around pension scheme management and oversight is almost two sides of the same coin. And I'll go into what I mean by that as we get into the substantive slides. We'll look at what we think trustees should be doing in terms of updating risk registers and getting this on event calendars and business plans and so on. We'll take you through our approach to complying with the general code and what we think you need to put into this in terms of making sure your scheme's compliant and what you should expect in terms of output and what your next steps should be. And we'll look specifically at the general code, which we've been waiting on now for about 3 years. It was originally consulted on in March 2021. It was finally laid before Parliament in January 2024, and the expectation that after sitting in Parliament for around 40 days, that it will come into force on the 27th of this month. So our working assumption is that the ESoG, ORA, and General Code jigsaw will be complete and in force come the 27th of March 2024. There's going to be ample opportunity for discussion, and you can ask questions either during the session or at the end. I think if you look at the top of the screen, the chat facility has been disabled, but next to it is a Q&A box, so please post your questions in there, and either I or Becca will pick them up, and we'll either respond to them during the session or get back to you in writing afterwards. But just to really kind of help us in terms of pitching this at the right level, we've got a couple of quick polls just in terms of what you know about the topic already, and perhaps even more importantly, what you've actually been doing about it. So Becca, if you could please launch the first poll for me, please. And I'll just give people around 30 seconds to complete the quite short poll. But the question is, what's your current level of preparedness? Not even started to think about it, some high level understanding, made a start, or completed a review. And I see that responses are starting to feed in now. And it does seem that the vast majority of people have a high level understanding, but no sort of definitive plans made yet. 1 in 5 respondents have made a start. I think, that's useful. And all I would add to that at this stage is, you're in line with our experience with other schemes. I think with the industry in general, based on the feedback that we've seen. So if we can close that poll, Becca, if you could launch the second one, please. Okay, the second one is, at this point, how do you think your governance will measure up? Once you've been through the whole process of checking your scheme against the governance code. Not at all. Some of the basics covered, but some fundamental gaps that will need some work. Largely complying, but just a little bit of revision here and there, or you're actually expecting your management and oversight to meet the requirements in full. Right. Okay. It looks like we have a real consensus there, with largely complying with some tweaks and improvements needed. That's a pretty good place to be. And my bigger surprise would be if anyone were to say that they expect to satisfy the requirements fully. I think I would struggle with that one a little bit for reasons that we'll get onto in terms of some of the provisions that are maybe quite new in terms of workplace pension scheme governance. So, turning now to the substantive presentation, I think it's important to note that while many schemes, trustees, administrators, and so on have been waiting for the pensions regulator's general code of practice before getting really stuck into this in earnest, the law has changed, and it actually changed some time ago. Regulations were published in 2018, which came into force in January 2019, replacing existing legislation. Now, the existing legislation used to say that trustees must have internal controls, system, processes, procedures, etc. And the revision made by Statutory Instrument 2018/1103 for the techies is that the revised legislation now says trustees must establish and operate an effective system of governance, including internal controls. So the addition there is the effective system of governance, or ESoG. Now, my reading of that is that there is an additional limb. So if you like, the bar in terms of your workplace pension scheme governance has been raised a bit. And we'll talk about the extent to which it has been raised, but maybe the most important criterion in that is that in addition to governance requirements perhaps becoming a bit more onerous, they've also become more scheme specific, because a principle of proportionality has been introduced. The legislation states that a pension scheme system of governance must be proportionate to the size of the scheme, the nature of the scheme, DBDC, scale and complexities, and complexity of the activities of the pension scheme. So that would take into account whether your scheme's in the process of winding up, maybe consolidating, or perhaps in the mid of a risk transfer exercise, for example. Now, I do want to stress this principle of proportionality, because this is not something that you'll find elaborated on in detail in the regulations or indeed in the Pensions Regulators Code of Practice. The principle of proportionality is something that needs to be decided at a scheme level, and the pensions regulator will not tell you what is proportionate to your scheme. That, I think quite rightly, is a matter for the trustees to use their own judgment as to what is an effective system of governance for their own workplace pension scheme. So I think it's important to take that away after this webinar. Maybe a key takeaway is in deciding what is or is not proportionate for your pension scheme. It is for the trustee board to make that final determination. But some things that I think all trustees do need to be aware of, maybe some familiar terminology here and some new terminology. Under the ESoG, ORA and general code requirements, all schemes, or at least schemes with more than 100 members, should have a risk management function. Now, look, a lot of schemes will already have a subcommittee, a risk committee that is responsible for looking at the risks that a scheme could be subject to, the likelihood of these risks occurring, and the impact that it would have on the scheme if they should actually occur. But you are going to have to revisit that risk function, even if you have it, to make sure that it is code compliant. And the general code does contain a bit of a description on what you would expect to see as part of a risk management function. Internal evaluation function we'll talk about in a bit more detail when we get onto the own risk assessment. But essentially that function looks or evaluates the system of governance of your pension scheme. So the important point here is that it's risk management and ESOG first, internal evaluation and ORA second. Actuarial function is used in the legislation, but it's nothing new in a UK context and doesn't mean much more than for a DB scheme, your scheme actuary. But an analogy can actually be made here for trustees who have DB schemes or who will be familiar with the concept of integrated risk management. And that's about ensuring things like your covenant, investment and funding considerations are looked at holistically and in a joined up way. You can think about that when you're thinking about ESOG and ORA as well, and the way that the different functions interact with each other. So it's just it's nothing that's set out in the code or legislation, but it's maybe just a way to think about it. And after this webinar, when you decide on what your project plan is going to be, to make sure that it is all properly joined up. So the two fundamental elements of pillars of this are the effective system of governance, ESOG, and the own risk assessment, ORA. And on this slide, what I've taken is effectively a direct paste from the regulations that I mentioned earlier. These are the statutory instrument that was made in 2018 and came into force in January 2019. And what these regulations say, and this is all fleshed out by the code, is that your ESOG should encompass sound and prudent management of activities, funding and investment, an adequate and transparent organizational structure, composition and constitution of the governing body, normally a board of trustees, effective system for ensuring transmission of information, statutory disclosure requirements, wider communication and reporting to bodies like HMRC and the pensions regulator, effective internal controls. That has been really a requirement in UK pensions law since 2005. Continuity and regularity in the performance of activities, including contingency plans. Again, something that a lot of pension schemes, even if only in operation for a few years, should be familiar with. A good example is some of the contingency planning that had to be put into place during the coronavirus restrictions. Trustees been able to meet online, trustees been able to make valid decisions digitally, electronic signatures and so forth. So it's envisaging some of the headwinds that you might face and how you would deal with them should they arise. Point F there is just the ever topical ESG and climate change factors. It's getting to the point now. It seems no presentation is complete without mention of environment, social and governance factors. And finally, at the bottom of that slide, the regular internal review kind of takes us back to the own risk assessment, which is a kind of, to me, as I've said already, is like the other side of the ESOG and ORA coin. And to take you through the ORA, Caitlin, I will pass over to you.
Thank you, John. So now you've heard how to establish an effective system of governance. What's next? Well, schemes with more than 100 members are required under the General Code to produce an own risk assessment known as the ORA. So the main point is that the ORA is not to be viewed as a tick box exercise, but more of an opportunity for the trustees to step back and consider how the board operates and complies with regulations. TPR expects the ORA to include information on how the trustees integrate their gap analysis findings in order to improve the scheme governance. Here we just wanted to note that the TPR are not expecting trustees to have 100% score or to have greens across the board. They're happy for trustees to implement some changes right away and give reason for other parts of the gap analysis for implementing change later down the line. TPR are also interested to see how trustees prevent conflicts of interest with the employer where key functions are outsourced, which is a point I'll come back to in my next slide. How the trustees assess the scheme funding needs with reference to recovery plans where applicable. Detail how the trustees assess risk to members and beneficiaries relating to paying out their benefits. The mechanisms which protect retirement benefits, such as guarantees or financial support from the principal employer. Assessment of operational risks. And for the last requirement, which John mentioned, the trustees are required to report on ESG factors, how they're considered when making investment decisions, and they're also required to report on how they would assess new or emerging ESG risks. And we just wanted to note here, we've added an asterisk to this point because in the general draft code, this was optional for trustees, but since we've seen the final code, this has now been made mandatory, so trustees will have to report on this in their ORAs going forward. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, trustees are required to report in the ORA regarding how they've prevented conflicts of interest with the employer where key functions are outsourced. So Spence reached out to DWP to query if certain people, such as pensions managers who are employed by the principal employer, would be prevented from carrying out their own risk assessment for the schemes, as would they see this as a conflict? And we didn't feel that this was clarified or made clear in the code. And DWP came back to confirm that they don't intend to exclude certain job holders from completing the risk assessment if they are employed by the principal employer. They reiterated that the trustees have the overall responsibility for the preparation of the ORA and have the power to delegate and take account of conflicts of interest. The trustees therefore ultimately can decide who completes the assessment as long as the conflicts have been considered. So hopefully that makes that part a bit clearer. And if none of my colleagues want to add any further, I will pass to my colleague Graham, who will talk about what's next.
Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks, John. So going over what John and Caitlin have covered so far, over the next few slides, I'd probably like to focus on how we at Spence would recommend you approach evidencing an effective system of governance, and also how on earth would you go about undertaking an own risk assessment with all the detail that's involved. So I think the first protocol is, as John alluded to earlier, you'd be looking as a trustee to establish a risk management team. So that could be like a subcommittee with terms of reference. And even for smaller schemes, that would be beneficial to do so. So it gives focus to the issue of ESOG and ORA. I think the next thing would be to understand the scheme's current situation, where it sits within the journey plan. Is it a scheme that's recently been bought in, or recently insured its liabilities? Is it a scheme that is looking to do that in the near future? Does it have a more longer term plan for buyout in mind? Is it a scheme that's maybe threatening to enter into the pension protection fund? Or is it a scheme that's looking to run on for the foreseeable future? All that fills in the colour of how you apply the proportionality to evidencing an effective system of governance as well. So the first thing, perhaps one of the early things you would look to do as a trustee, is the members of the risk management team would seek to draft trustee policies on the three key functions that John mentioned earlier, and also an outsourcing policy to cover what you do with suppliers and how you evidence their governance requirements. We have a scheme-specific governance framework in mind for fulfilling these tasks, which I'll go on to explain in a bit more detail later. But essentially, the framework aims to record every aspect of your scheme's operation and management. So you can probably imagine that it potentially has the capacity to be quite a lengthy document. So you're looking at every single detail of your scheme to see what's relevant and what's not. And by doing so, you can then apply the application of proportionality to each aspect of your scheme's governance, line by line, and recording a rationale for whether or not you fulfill a governance requirement there, or whether you don't think it's required, or what level you think it's required to. So you complete that scheme-specific review of all your governance, and then following that, it leads into a scheme-specific review of your governance documents. So that's your policies, processes, procedures, logs. And then from there, effectively, this is your gap analysis. What's missing? What needs to be there? What's there already that's perhaps superfluous? And this is where you start thinking about the proportionality aspects of evidencing your governance in place at the moment. Move on to the next slide, please. So from there, you can start considering the order of priority that you want to potentially fill gaps, or draft new policies and procedures to improve the effectiveness of your governance. And given that you're then beginning to think about an order of priority, of course, you're then thinking about timescales for this type of work. So you probably would look to build those timescales into your scheme's business plan. Something that's regularly reported at trustee meetings and in between trustee meetings. So that ticks a box of ongoing monitoring. It's a real live issue. Your governance framework is a living and breathing document that you should continuously look to improve. John mentioned earlier, of course, is you would want to reflect this within your risk register as well, anything that comes from the work that you undertake on your governance framework. And that leads into knowing what you have in place, knowing how effective it is, and knowing how you can test the effectiveness of all that. So stress testing, in other words. What do you do in the event of a cyber security breach? Is there some way that you can simulate a cyber security breach? I think John mentioned earlier as well, do you have a contingency plan in place? If the trustee chair is unable to attend a meeting at short notice, can the meeting still go ahead? Can you make decisions in the way that you should be? Do you have a deputy chair? In other words, do you have a contingency plan in the event of something that's unexpected? So governance framework would look to incorporate a timetable for all of this work for each element of your governance and the operations and management of your scheme. And at the end of all this, it would be designed to then present to your trustee board to agree all of the above and record the approval. But of course, we would probably envisage that to be a continuous process and not something that once done gets put back in a shelf and left to gather dust for another 3 years. So if we move on to the next slide, this hopefully brings a bit of colour to the words and gives you an example of what we think a governance framework and assessment would look like. So I mentioned before that this is something that would probably be possibly in excess of 200 lines. So, for ease of your eyes, we were just focusing on around 10 lines at the moment, and in a particular area of governance, which is GDPR. So on the left-hand side, we seek to outline each aspect of GDPR we think requires attention. We have a segregation of responsibilities and duties in relation to that. So the second column refers to ownership. So is it the trustees that lead that? Is it the scheme secretary? Do we have another subcommittee that is really in control of that aspect of the governance? And as you can see in the third column, quite simply, there's a red, amber and green rating applied to where we think we currently sit with that aspect of the governance. So red, of course, means that it's missing or is completely inadequate. Amber suggests that there is something in place already, but perhaps it needs a bit of work, perhaps it needs a bit of updating. And green suggests that we're satisfied with what's in place there and that it's effective and operational. And you flesh that out, of course, on the right-hand side with some comments and notes. So a lot of what the legislation of effective system of governance encourages you to do is to document how you are adhering to the effective system of governance, and this would be the framework for doing that. So in other words, you've got the input and you've got the process by completing the governance framework. And on the next slide, you should hopefully see some sort of output that can be presented to trustees or externally or internally, which aims to give an at-a-glance overview of where the scheme currently sits in terms of being able to demonstrate an effective system of governance. That would aim to be a useful reporting tool. Again, it's something that can be compared against whether improvements need to be made. It can be reported as frequently as you would like. And I think once you've done all that work, you'll have a better handle on how you're going to complete your own risk assessment and how you're going to address any gaps within the scheme, which leads me nicely, I think, over to Rachel, who will begin to talk about how we might want to address some of those gaps.
Thank you, Graham. Yes, so once you have the governance framework done and you've seen the report back which identifies the areas where there are gaps, the next step really is to look at how we can help our clients improve the scheme's governance framework. And some of our colleagues in-house have developed a suite of template policies, procedures and processes which cover the governing body, administration, communication, funding and investments. And we can use that suite of documents to help our clients demonstrate good governance and comply with these new requirements. We want to help our clients avoid looking at these new requirements as a checklist of documents that you just need to tick off and have on file. And instead, our aim is to help our clients make good governance a key part of their culture. Just on to the next slide then, as John mentioned earlier, we've had a 3-year wait, but we now have the final version of the general code, and that's what we're seeing as really the final piece of the jigsaw here. The code explains to trustees and to scheme managers of private and public sector pension schemes the standards of conduct and practice expected of them when carrying out functions under pensions legislation, and it will assist them in complying with the legal requirements. As John said, the code isn't entirely prescriptive. Judgment is going to need to be exercised considering what's reasonable for ensuring compliance for each individual pension scheme. Just on the next page then, the next slide, we've set out here, there's been quite a few changes to the general code from the draft version of the code that we had seen initially. Now I'll not go through all of these, and I think it was Caitlin had pointed out the environmental, social and governance new requirements for trustees, but just also in terms of the own risk assessment, the regulator have said they don't have plans to produce guidance on completing the own risk assessment, but they have helpfully set out a 2.5-page document of expectations, which is helpful. And with regards to stewardship, the regulator have said governing bodies should consider following the principles set out in the Financial Reporting Council's Stewardship Code. Now, that code defines stewardship as the responsible allocation, management and oversight of capital to create long-term value for clients and beneficiaries, leading to sustainable benefits for the economy, the environment and the society. So that's just some of the headline changes that we've seen in the final version of the code then from the draft code. The new code, you might remember, it was once been referred to as the single code of practice, but it's now referred to as the general code, and that's because the general code consolidates 10 of the pension regulators' code of practice, not all of them. So you'll see here we put a tick beside the pensions regulators' code of practices, which are covered by the general code. I also understand there's a code 16 for collective DC schemes for anybody that might be on that's relevant to, but that's not on the slide. But yeah, as far as we know, there's no immediate plans to consolidate all of the regulators' codes of practice just now. But as I say, this general code that we've now had led before Parliament encompasses 10 of the regulators' codes of practice. I think I'm handing over to you at that point then, John.
Yeah, I think you are. And thanks, Rachel. I'll maybe just go back one slide. something that I did. I noticed at the top of the slide on headline changes from the draft, and the first bullet point refers to EDI, and I can give myself a slap on the wrist for being a usual pensions practitioner and for getting
I think
Has
John
John
is frozen on us.
Oh no. Okay.
Just give him a minute to see if he just reconnects. There we go.
Yep. Rachel, is that me back?
Is she back, John?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Apologies, everyone. I don't know if it was my connection or someone else's. Yes, so I was just correcting something on the headline changes from the code. So EDI refers to equality, diversity and inclusion, and it is quite an important one because this is something that's new to the general code that you won't find in the old codes of practice. And where this manifests itself is in areas like the composition of the trustee board. So the regulator is now looking for trustees to take into account equality, diversity and inclusion when putting together the nomination and selection procedures for member-nominated trustees or directors. So apologies there for including abbreviation without definition. Right, that takes me on then to the next steps and what I think, what do you do from here? What are the key takeaways? Well, for me, the first one is all about ownership. If your scheme has more than 100 members, then you do need that risk management function. That's a requirement. If you have less than 100 members, you are still going to have to do something with the general code and ESOG. So think about who you want to own that responsibility. Is it a subcommittee, or do you want to bring somebody independent in to deal with it? And that's really up to the trustee board to determine the best way to take this forward. Then I think there are actually two ways of going about this, the whole process for general code, ESOG and ORA. And one way I've actually seen it described, although I'm not sure the pensions regulator would like it, was that it depends on which end of the telescope that you're looking into. You could just look at what the minimum requirements are from the regulator in terms of all the policies and other documents, and remembering that not all policies are relevant to all schemes. It will depend if you're defined benefit, defined contribution. It will depend on what your activities are. It will depend on the size of your pension scheme. And you may actually get to a point you say, well, okay, what we've got here is X number of policies. And in actual fact, the scheme already has most of these in place. But look, even if you take that approach, you're going to have to look at these policies and make sure that they remain fully fit for purpose with the new general code of practice and the requirements and the regulations that I've alluded to. The other way, and this does seem to be the preferred approach that the regulator would like to see, and it's a way that many in the industry have interpreted these new requirements, is to stop thinking about this in terms of a checklist and to think about it more in terms of a culture. And that's why we recommend this approach of a kind of governance review of governance framework, actually going through all the elements of the operation of your pension scheme. And that's what your ESOG is. Everything that affects the operation of your pension scheme is part of your pension scheme system of governance. And in going through that operation of your pension scheme, you will identify any policies, procedures, templates, etc. that might be needed, but you'll also, I think, get a lot more from the actual review that you've undertaken in terms of making sure your scheme is being run as effectively as it possibly can be. And you really shouldn't underestimate, in my opinion, just the importance of good governance to the outcome of your pension scheme members. Enough said on that. Whatever approach that you take, remember that within probably a couple of years' time, you are going to have to undertake an own risk assessment, at least if your scheme has more than 100 members. And that is an internal evaluation of your scheme's system of governance. So you're going to have to think about your system of governance at some point over the coming months and years. And just to drill that down a little bit, because the timescales for the own risk assessment have changed from the draft code to the final code, the final code is in line with the regulation, and it states that the ORA should be 12 months after the end of the first scheme year. That's the scheme year that you use for your report and accounts that begins after the code comes into force, 27th of March 2024, we believe, or if later, and remember these are if later limbs, within 15 months beginning with the date on which the trustees are required to obtain an actuarial valuation, so probably only relevant to a DB or hybrid scheme, or by the date on which the trustees are next required to prepare a chair's annual governance statement, the chair's statement, which is for schemes which contain DC benefits. Having done your first ORA, then becomes a little bit simpler in that subsequent ORAs are then done on a triennial basis. Importantly, it is an evaluation. It is not an audit. It is not an accreditation. So you don't have to have your ORA formally audited. You don't have to appoint a qualified auditor to do it. And it's not analogous with some of the accreditations that you might have seen from your administrators, like AAFs on administration or ISOs on information security. It is less formal than that. And again, the principle of proportionality will be relevant to your own risk assessment as it is to your effective system of governance. So in addition to thinking who's taking ownership of the ESOG, in time, you'll also have to think about who's taking ownership of the ORA. That could be somebody within the trustee body or in other aspects of the administration and management of the scheme, or consideration could be given to an independent member of the governing board, but that is not a legal requirement. That is pretty much what we wanted to say about ESOG and ORA and the general code. I'll just stop sharing my screen just now. And we're happy to take questions and observations. So please do post them to the Q&A box. But before we get on to that, in light of what you heard, I just want to kind of revisit the gist of what we asked at the start of the presentation and see if views have changed in any way, now that we know a bit more about the detail. So Becca, if I could get you to launch the final poll for me, please. I'll just give that a few seconds. Okay, it's not changed much, largely complying with some tweaks and improvements. And I think that's a good place to be. I'll make two observations, maybe at either end of the spectrum. First of all, I think that trustees of schemes should have started discussing this with their advisors, even though the general code has just been published and it's not yet enforced for another few weeks. Why? Because the law changed in January 2019. And I think it's incumbent upon schemes to have had this on trustee meeting agendas by now. I do not think that any scheme should be saying that they satisfy the requirements fully. For reasons I think we've alluded to, that there are some new concepts in there. And the expectation is similar, I suppose, to other forms of assessment, in that the ESOG and ORA is supposed to be a system of continual improvement. So at the moment, when you do your ESOG and subsequently do your ORA, and that is the order in which you do it, the regulator will not be asking you to report on your activities in the scheme return as it stands. But we largely suspect at some point in the future, the pensions regulator will be asking for management information around what people are doing in this governance area. And I think, for the schemes that report that there is absolutely nothing that needs to be done with the scheme could possibly raise an eyebrow at the pensions regulator as much as schemes that are maybe materially underperforming. As I say, because there is meant to be this idea of a continual system of improvement. Yes, sorry, Becca, I was just going to ask, can you see any questions?
Yes, there are a couple. Would you like? I'll publish the first one. Posted
Lovely,
by
thank you very much.
Shliz, can you see that?
Okay, so question there. Will the General Code, ESOG and ORA demand compulsory competitive tenders for all scheme advisors, administrators and independent trustees at least every 3 years? Well, it won't demand it. It won't legally require it. I mean, my own view on that is, having going through the process, that might, and you get your gap analysis that Graham referred to, where there's areas for improvement, that goes back to the trustee board, and the trustees make a decision on the back of that, that in actual fact, the response to the finding of the governance review is maybe the scheme could be better run, but by doing that tender process. Graham, this is maybe an area that you touched on. Is there anything that you would add to that?
No, not really, John. I think you covered it in one of your later slides, and to say that it's maybe not as formal as being an audit. It's not something that we're going to get any specific accreditation on, but it's to be ready to demonstrate the effective system of governance. I think it's certainly something that needs to be kept on trustee meeting agendas on a regular basis and kept on the radar. Probably the concern about these things is that you do a one-off exercise and then completely forget all about it as your day-to-day activities take over. But it's something that needs to be continuously done. So these conversations with advisors, suppliers, etc., need to be ongoing.
Okay. Thank you. And another question there. Mention has been made of 100 or more members. Indeed it has. What if the membership is less than 100? Okay, this is fairly clear cut. And the situation is that if your scheme has more than 100 members, you need your risk management function and you need to do an own risk assessment. If your scheme has less than 100 members, you don't have to have that formal risk management function. You don't have to do an own risk assessment. You can do an evaluation if you wish. But although you're not subject to the ORA, essentially all schemes are subject to the effective system of governance. All occupational pension schemes, apart from master trust schemes, are subject to ESOG. And the only reason that master trusts are not subject to ESOG is because master trusts have their own master trust assurance framework. Okay, I'm not seeing anything else. Sorry, Becca, were you saying that something had just been posted?
No, John, just saying there's no more in review.
Okay. In which case, we won't detain people any longer than is necessary. I just want to say thank you for attending. I think I omitted to actually introduce myself at the start, even though I introduced everyone else. My name is John Wilson, and I'm Head of Technical Research and Policy. As I say, I was joined today by Rachel Graham, by Graham Cunningham, and by Caitlin Watson, and our moderator today was Rebecca Lavender from our marketing practice. We have recorded this presentation. We'll give you a link to it, hopefully later on this afternoon. If any issues come to you after the webinar, don't hesitate to get in touch with any of the speakers today, or with your usual Spence and Partners contact. Just thanks again for attending, and we hopefully look forward to helping you with all your ESOG and ORA requirements in the future. Thank you and have a good afternoon.